But I like to say what we went through was a car crash, not a plane crash, because ultimately investors were taken care of and it allows people to come back and build on careers and stuff afterwards. So I think those are the biggest things. I mean, the mechanical side of operations is sort of can't be overstated because at that point, everybody's got to be talking together, right? When you make those decisions, the vacuum is the firm, the operations team, the investment team, and it's inherently a little bit conflicted because 6 months earlier, you're thinking, or some period earlier, you're thinking, how are we going to invest? And then you're thinking, like, how are we going to stop that and protect clients, which I think you got to come together. And it's not an easy decision, but it was ultimately done, I think, as well as could possibly be done.
I'm Aoifinn.
And I'm Tom Raber.
And welcome to this Alvine Talks podcast, in which we chat with allocators and thinkers across the world of investment and bring them some Alvine level debate. We're joined today by Nate Kirk, who's the founder of Everside Capital Partners, which he founded in 2016 together with Moritz Poehl. Everside is a private credit fund focused on the middle and lower middle market based in New York City. He was previously a portfolio manager at Third Avenue Management, where he focused on stressed and distressed credit, special situations, and flexible credit. And prior to that, worked as a trader and high-yield credit researcher at JP Morgan. He is also a keen rower. Welcome, Nate. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on board, Nate. Before we start talking about what you've done in the investment field, it would be great if you were able to give us some insight into your childhood, your education, and your personal background.
Sure. I'm happy to. Thanks for the question. So I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, stateside, and I went to a small school called Shady Hill, and then to a place called Phillips Academy, which was a boarding school. Phillips Academy, Andover. And then I went to Yale for undergraduate and I majored in political science and economics. And then I went to Cambridge University on the other side of the pond for graduate school. The common thread in there was probably, as we get into it later, was mentorships. And as Aoifinn mentioned, rowing. I rowed in high school, in college, and then for Cambridge. And it left a big impression on my life in terms of just sort of experience professionally. I wouldn't call what I did when I was in my teens the professional finance side, but I was a painter inside of houses, nothing that's that beautiful. And then I worked as a busboy and as a waiter. That is actually pretty interesting because you do end up learning how to deal with all sorts of people, the happy customers, and maybe more importantly, the not so happy customers. And I think, you just generally get an idea of sort of what the flow of life and business are. It's much more than, we'll probably talk a lot more about finance here, but it ends up being a very real side of how people interact and the economy.
I love that. Well, certainly you're not the first guest we've had that started out painting houses. Often the sheer hustle factor to get that painting job. And also there's a bit of teamwork involved in getting the perfect product off. And getting back to rowing. So again, I'd love to just pick up on that because obviously it's a sport, again, that we see quite a lot of representation in the world of finance. What is it you think about rowing that makes you suited then to go into a career that's as fast paced as this one?
So rowing, yeah, that's a great question. Rowing is sort of a fascinating sport in that, I always say to people that are in it or people that are looking more at it is that it doesn't really have a future. In the sense that there's not a deep profession ahead of you. So then it ends up being quite focused on sort of the people and the process around what rowing really is. And I mean, first and foremost, you definitely learn about hard work, just sort of training early hours, the discipline with it. It's quite a thankless task in a sense. I mean, you could be sitting on a machine for an hour and a half, staring at nothing but numbers, and you're trying to get them to go faster. And the only obstacle is really the pain that you're willing to take on. And so you do sort of learn what it takes to win. I would say the second thing is humility, because over time, I think I remember one year in college, the fittest I ever was probably our most losing season. And so you learn that personal sacrifice, you can give as much as you want to something. And then all of a sudden you look back and the scoreboard is ultimately how the team performs, which is probably a good segue into what I would say the third segment is, which is really team chemistry. And that is ultimately something that every person on a team is different. What they bring to the party, one of my coach says, is always different. You get sort of all different shapes and sizes. You get some people who you think that you would beat right away in what's called a seat race, where you race people and they switch to see who's faster. And all of a sudden they beat you. And you don't know what it was. You don't know if it was the other guys. You don't know how it all came together, but ultimately that's the result. And there's a selection process around it. And then afterwards, you have to live with the result. Then you win or you lose with that whole group. And so it ends up being incredibly formative for how people, I think personally, how I chose to work with groups and mentors, and then built our own team here at Everside.
Well, that's interesting, Nate. Obviously, you've got a great academic background. You're a fantastic rower, and then you decided to embark on Wall Street. Was that always inevitable, or were there other career paths that you were thinking of? And once you've answered that, how did you actually enter Wall Street?
Okay, so that's a good question. I mean, the truth is that when I was training in terms of rowing and stuff like that, I was actually never the best rower. I had probably two specific sit downs by way of form. I was never the best rower. I had two specific sit downs with coaches where they basically said to me, Nate, you are not the best candidate for this seat. There's basically a list of people we would put in front of you, but you have this sort of masochistic and competitive side of you that you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And so for that reason, we can't not put you in the boat. So it ended up being sort of a happy coincidence that way. To go to the professional side, I would actually also say my academic career really responded pretty well to when I had mentors push me. So I sort of like everything on the line and sort of how do you respond? I think there's two camps of people. There's those that respond to sort of pride and growth and the sky's the limit. And then there's those that respond to like fear and just hard work. And I'm definitely in the other camp. And I don't know what that really says about me as a person, but ultimately when I was interviewing for my jobs, each time, I've been through a couple different firms. You sit down with somebody and they basically want to figure out, is this somebody I want to spend 15 hours a day with? Most people pass the intelligence test. The other is, do they want to show up early and leave late? And I think rowing probably indicates that I'm more than willing to do that. But the last is, do you really want to spend time with somebody? And is that somebody who's sort of got your back when all the chips are down? And I think in that sense, rowing does prepare you for life, and conveying that's really important. I haven't really shared before the story about how I got my first job, but I was connected. So I finished the boat race in spring of '04, and I ended up emailing everybody that I knew because I was training so much. I basically didn't get my act together in the fall for when recruiting happens for finance. But looking for finance, I mean, one of the major attributes was I came out of Cambridge with student debt. And so finance was a good way to pay it back. And I really, having gone to school in the States and then come back for graduate school, I missed my friends in the US. And my parents said I would be crazy not to live in the UK, in a place where I sort of built all these relationships and this network. And I was just, I sort of went against their judgment and said, you know what, I got to go back to friends that I know. And so New York sort of pulled me back that way. But, I'll admit part of the allure was getting out of some of the debt. And then when I interviewed, I actually got connected with somebody, and it was about 4:30 in the morning. And I wrote the guy back. He reached out to me when he woke up at 4:30. I wrote him back at like 4:35. And he was like, either you're up really early or you're desperate. It was a little bit of both, because I was sleeping on friends' couches, couch surfing, basically trying to interview and find a job. And so I think he saw right away that there was sort of a work ethic and an edge around that. And I found that that was a really productive first step for me. And that's sort of how I got into finance. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. And I think that's certainly why rowing, obviously those early starts are part and parcel of getting in the boat. That's probably why as a sport, it echoes through. And then moving to Everside, I know, Tom, that was over to you, the Everside origins.
Yeah, no, I obviously, as you know, we know each other from Wall Street and the finance, and we have been connected through the fantastic firm of Everside. And we're very keen to hear the background to Everside and how you started the firm and how you found your niche.
So it's interesting. I think, obviously we go back with Tom and we think really highly of him and Alvine and the firm. I think if you go through what I experienced from going through, I was at JP Morgan for better part of a decade, and then a firm called Third Avenue, investing in distressed. And that transition, it was pretty formative. I think the Everside side of it came out of Third Avenue. And it was predominantly because, I mean, when I was at Third Avenue, we were investing in distressed and we went through a lot of reorganizations, and it was interesting intellectually, but, ultimately we ran that out of a daily liquidity vehicle, and we had to put the gates up on investors, which was a pretty important decision. It was very, very stressful, and it was incredibly instructive from a client experience perspective. And if you go into what Everside is and what we're trying to provide for clients, it's really, for us, we wanted the end outcome to be very successful for clients through cycles. We didn't want it to be sort of a boom bust investment experience. And so that was what we set out to do over about a decade ago. And that's held up pretty well. I would say from a formative experience, the fundamental difference between where I spent 15 years of my life in sort of broader syndicated larger markets and where we are now, which is really the lower middle market, is that this world effectively operates much more the lower middle market on simpler companies. They're effectively bilateral relationships. So it's not a lot of hands in there. And that does lead to, I think, more aligned and better investment outcomes as long as it's underwritten and understood. But the two sort of prior experience at Third Avenue did really lead to sort of how we structured and set up Everside, especially with the end exposure we're trying to get for clients.
Right. But may I have a follow-up questions? I just wanted to ask you more specifically about the credit markets. They have obviously grown exponentially in the last few years. And some people have a question, where is this going to end up? And I also, in that regard, want to talk to you about, there has been some concerns recently. There's been a First Brands concern and others. And then there have been some trends in terms of evergreen funds. So I just wanted to give you, if you don't mind, a little bit of a macro view from where you sit and where the credit markets are and where they're going.
So predicting where they're going is pretty tough, but I think where I stand and where I think credit is the growth to call it a $2 trillion asset class is probably surprising to most people, but I don't think it's a huge deal. And I think it came mainly out of regulatory change. So the market itself hasn't grown itself. It's more the private management of it. And I think from that perspective, it's probably not as bad or as scary as people think. It isn't really a world that we play deeply in, but having spent a while in it, I do think you have to ask yourself the same question that we asked ourselves when we were starting Everside, which is this growth and our evergreen structures better for clients? And I think that's sort of a fundamental question, which with the instance of First Brands, it does sort of knock at it. And from what we know about First Brands, and I'm not deeply in this world as much anymore, but it was a multi-billion-dollar senior facility that was basically off balance sheet financing that most people who were invested in that secured facility probably knew and understood pretty well. But just that the actual broader bonds and loans of that went from par to 50 cents, even to 30 cents, depending, even lower if you're in junior debt, implies that since that happened over basically a 1 to 2 week period, even the most savvy institutional investors were not aware of that. And I think that gets into the private and public disclosure side. People in high yield and leveraged loans, there's always been sort of a gray area around what's disclosed and what's available privately versus publicly. And I think this probably does transition into the evergreen discussion, because as more and more private investors are brought into this, there's a question around transparency and disclosure of information. And I don't think private credit in and of itself is a problem. It's really that, like, who gets into it and what do people know when they're doing that? And I think that even if the private investor isn't day to day on the front lines of being able to understand that, they hire somebody to do that. That's totally fine. But if there's a $6 billion facility that's getting proposed by an investment bank and it falls apart and then the legacy debt drops by 50 cents, there's something there telling you that not everybody was aware of it. So I think this gets into sort of like, what is the nature of that? And you're not going to have a single holder of $6 billion of debt. So it's definitely a multi-handed deal or a broadly syndicated loan. And I think, we do look at it because I think broader credit, we get put into that bucket. I think the difference for what we look at is that we're way below that radar. So $50 to $200 million term loans in broader credit is comfortably above what we invest in or get exposure to for our clients. And so it's not to say that it doesn't work if you're up market. It's just inherently more efficient because people can write those checks and they can give up a little bit on structure or price. And then all of a sudden, something that was an 8 or a 9% loan turns quickly into a 7% loan without covenants. And so you see right now as people go into all the exercise associated with businesses like this, whether it's ABL financing or broader direct lending, the businesses, the private credit groups don't really want to file these companies for bankruptcy, and they're not prepared to. It's not that they couldn't afford it, the business. It's just, it leads into a lot more creditor on creditor violence. And that's because lots of other creditors get into this and everybody sort of lawyers up when a bad event happens. In down market, it's not that the businesses don't have issues. They certainly have issues, and it never is up and to the right. But if you think about it, just like 2 or 3 underlying counterparties are going to work that out around a table. It's a slightly different dynamic. And to go to your comment on evergreen structures, I think evergreen structures are really interesting because they do solve something that clients are looking for, which is they don't want lots of capital calls. They want predictable distributions. They want sort of like a big stable structure. And the only issue I see with it is that, and you're going to see it the longer and longer these evergreen structures stay outstanding, is that in credit, if it's a good credit, if the company's performing well, they refinance out. So when they refinance out, you either get a lower rate if you stay in that structure, or the loan disappears from the portfolio and it goes to, let's say it goes from one large private credit fund to JP Morgan, then all of a sudden the loans that are the most troubled end up in that evergreen structure because they don't sort of get refinanced. And I think we're too young in that to right now to see it, but at a certain size, it's not material for these evergreen funds, but maybe in 12 to 24 months, we see more of that.
Just building on that, you mentioned what investors think about when they think about private credit. Would you say that those needs are evolving, and in particular with the rates seemingly coming down, and therefore private credits, the floating rates there likely to come down? We've seen this probably, not sure it's peak demand, but certainly a very high level of demand for private credit. Do you see anything from the investor side that is notable?
It's a great question. Yeah. I mean, right now, broader credit, leveraged loans and high yield, I think of that as like a $2 to $3 trillion total market. All in rates for those are 7 to 8%, which is kind of what, if you look through cycles, what that's provided, that asset class. And it's always been somewhat in demand, and its performance tends to follow capital flows. And so if the Fed is signaling they're going to cut 100 to 200 basis points, you may want to own the long treasury bond, because that in the Barclays Ag might be because of duration. And if rates are coming down, you might get a 10 to 20% return holding just something simple because it has a duration of 10 to 15. And all in rates coming lower is a good thing for that. It also is a good thing for credit. And credit, it's at the tights now in terms of spread. And it's about 300 over a 5 to 7 year treasury. So that's supposed to compensate you for the default risk, which we just talked about with First Brands. It's out there, but it's embedded in the returns. So you worry that there's going to be a huge slew of defaults and then recoveries are low because that spread encompasses both of those pieces of math. But historically, that's been pretty ample coverage through economic cycles to take care of you. So I don't think broader credit is unattractive in that sense. But you do sort of want to say, like, can I get excess yield other places that are at least as stable? And I think you can get paid for going to less efficient parts of that market, which I think is still likely happening until sort of the tide goes out. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. And just following up, so speaking of tide going out and the kind of volatility that seems to be inherent in credit markets and certainly public credit markets, what would you say, just looking back at your career in terms of ups and downs? We didn't necessarily talk in detail about any of the kind of setbacks there. Was there anything that I think made you more resilient and more ready to face the world as a founder, and particularly in the credit area?
It's interesting. It's a good question. From my perspective, it usually has less to do with individual events than if you take a step back and look at the people that were around you in those events and sort of how you responded to it as a team and as a person. And I would say it should be the top of everybody's list that you find a good mentor. And I would say if you go back, for me anyway, to JP Morgan, I had a terrific mentor in David Kamen, and he ran high yield research. And he was thoughtful, paternalistic, incredibly smart. There was no ego. People get viewed commercially all the time to varying degrees. Do they have all those things? But to a person, you really want to make sure, like I was saying earlier, does someone sort of have your back? That was the same with Tom LaPointe, who ran the Third Avenue Credit Fund. Good investor. When I was doing a reference on, is this somebody who I want to work for? Somebody told me Tom LaPointe would drive 12 hours in the rain to get you cough medicine for your child. I mean, that's sort of the kind of guy who you want to learn from and be around. So I think mentorship is absolutely number one on the list. At the same time, you can't have somebody who you don't respect, and you want to basically work with people that make you better all the time. And that goes for growing, that goes for picking a spouse, in my opinion. But they don't have to be better in everything than you, but they have to bring something to the party that really sort of makes you better. And it's definitely the case with us. Like my business partner, Moritz, has so many things that I don't have, and I learn from him every day. Same with our director of investments, Francesco. It has to go up and down the food chain. Our COO, Ben, who joined with us, having 20 years of prior COO experience. These things, you just have to learn from those people around you. And then I'd say probably the third and last thing is that you've got to stay curious. Everything that you do, if we were all the same people we were 20 years ago, no one would really advance. I mean, for me, that's definitely true. And especially moving from upmarket to a world that I had no network, no prior experience 10 years ago, you really have to embrace that and like read incessantly. And people know when you're interested in what they're talking about and when you're not. And so if you sort of find that, get that counterpart in what you do, both as a day-to-day matter, ultimately in like a detail matter, then when you have instances where things just don't go your way, you're going to lean on your mentorship, the people you work with. And basically, do you want to lean back into what you're doing if it doesn't go perfectly? And I think that's probably ties it together.
So I just want to ask you, how does that tie in with your leadership role at Everside? I mean, all the things you said, are they all baked into one? And are you therefore also, hopefully, a good mentor to all the people working for you and the young people in particular?
Yeah, it's interesting. I give people the same advice I say here, which is you got to find somebody who's going to be a good mentor. And that doesn't mean someone, like if I directly sit down and walk through a balance sheet with somebody, is that valuable? Or do they need someone on our team because we have a culture of people that would do that? I think both sort of have to be true. And to go into the point on curiosity, I think people would definitely tell you that, for everything related to even going into something a couple of years ago, I had no idea related to AI, sort of embrace it, and you have to know that it's going to happen to you and just try to understand it. And it's less of an enigma now, but these things are pretty important. And to the point also on curiosity, you kind of have to know what you don't know. And if you have a respect for that sort of emptiness, that space that like you're kind of too nervous if you're too nervous to ask about it, it means you probably need to learn a little bit more. And I think everybody on the team our team anyway, has that intellectual curiosity. And obviously, as a senior member of the firm, you have to have some sort of horizon perspective. And I think it's funny, I didn't really think about tying it back to this, but in rowing, we train 9 months a year, 40 hours a week for like 5 races. And if you told most athletes that that's the amount of training they'd have to do for the amount of racing they'd get to do, you have to have some perspective. And I think as a leader of the firm, we got to have that. And leading by example, I guess, is probably one. I try not to you try to, in micro things in a meeting, I think it's pretty interesting to get the younger people and the less experienced people speaking first. Because honestly, if you say your perspective, they're more likely to just fall in line. I mean, you're both very senior people. You're smart. You probably know the answer, but getting the younger people to speak is actually a really important part of allowing them to develop, I think.
And speaking of leadership, there's one thing I just wanted to get back to, which I think maybe getting onto the learning experience, gating a fund. I think you have experience there. And I suppose one lives and learns, but I think it would be great because, we may not be entering a phase of strain in the credit environment now, but, we may. And I suppose, what were some of the lessons learned there in terms of how to lead?
Gosh, I mean, there's so many things in that because you have investment risk, you have client and marketing risk, and you have operations risk. And for us, when we were at Third Avenue, what we ultimately figured out was having that structure was really difficult when we didn't know. I mean, this was in 2015, but a lot of the banks had pulled back the capital they were holding on their balance sheet to invest in distressed and high yield. And I think people knew there was more of a liquidity crunch there. And being aware of that and how it relates to structure I think, is really important. As you go to these evergreen funds, a lot of the underlying assets may not be publicly traded. But if people are repeatedly asking for redemptions, even if it's done in a graduated way, it still has to be understood as like an overhang for the market. So I don't think structure would cure everything, but it definitely teaches you how to handle it. I mean, you see a little bit of the PR difficulties around something like Blackstone's credit fund, not to pick on anybody, but the real estate fund. And I think they handled it really well. It's just a hard situation to be in when public and media perception build up on that. And I think from our perspective, what you really want to make sure that you're doing first and foremost for everything is taking care of clients. Because if you take care of clients, they'll trust you, and they should. But that's like, if you lose that, everything is gone. And so I think one of the experiences we ultimately had with the Third Avenue was that we had to do it to protect investors, and investors were taken care of. And it was not an easy decision because we were one of the first 40 Act funds to put up gates on investors. So I think you end up making those decisions in a vacuum. But to the comment on mentors and stuff like that, you want to make sure that you have people that have clients back and have your clients, their back, their support. And then you'll make the right decision. And ultimately, these things do happen. But I like to say what we went through was a car crash, not a plane crash, because ultimately investors were taken care of, and it allows people to come back and build on careers and stuff afterwards. So I think those are the biggest things. I mean, the mechanical side of operations is sort of can't be overstated, because at that point, everybody's got to be talking together, right? When you make those decisions, the vacuum is the firm, the operations team, the investment team, and it's inherently a little bit conflicted because 6 months earlier, you're thinking, how are we, or some period earlier, you're thinking, how are we going to invest? And then you're thinking, like, how are we going to stop that and protect clients, which I think you got to come together. And it's not an easy decision, but it was ultimately done, I think, as well as could possibly be done. It's a good question.
Thanks, Nate. Well, we've covered a lot. You've got obviously an incredible background. You've had a very interesting career, and you're now running at a very young age, a very successful credit firm yourself with a fantastic team. And at the same time as you've had almost an athlete's career running parallel, you've got 3 kids. Your wife is very busy. So the question I suppose everyone would ask is, how do you get the balance right between work and outside life? And how do you make sure that you don't push yourself too far?
Yeah, I'm not sure balance is probably the right term. We don't really get it. I probably have it ends up being like a give and take. Balance sort of is such a simple term that implies that everything is always just so. I think our life is probably more like a seesaw. So we have a 9, 11, and a 12-year-old at home. And yes, my wife has an incredible career, and she runs like Aoifinn, maybe not as many marathons, but she's run 30, and she wants to be breaking 3 hours again. I mean, the ambition behind that is just over my head in a way. I have enormous respect for it. And she's just joined the New York Roadrunners board, which is, it is her passion. We try to keep these things aligned and make sure that, like, if we're giving extra time away from each other, that these things really matter. And then I think I actually just asked my 12-year-old the other day, I think I'm there for you when you've got your games. Do you feel like I'm present? And he was like, well, the ones you make, yes. So we don't make all the games. We can't do that. Of course, when you're there, you got to be fully there, and they know it. And I try not to be the parent screaming in the background. And one thing that we brought up, my wife and I, is that for that, we do enjoy that and love seeing she rode as well. So I think the kids see that the competitive dynamic and the teamwork is just a part of life, and that they know that we're going to put as much behind the sport or whatever endeavor it is, my daughter's recorder, as they do. And no more, but hopefully no less. And in that sense, I think everybody ends up finding some sort of an equilibrium.
Thank you, Nate. That's a good answer. Aoifinn.
Yes, well, as the marathoner here amongst us, hats off dramatically for the below 3 hour time aspiration. And it sounds like it's a repeat. So definitely that's in another league entirely. And I don't think any of us make all the games we would like to make. I think it's a question of, as you said, making the ones that matter and being there where we are. My last question is around advice. Mentorship has come out very loud and clear, I think, from your activities, from getting into this industry, and from the industry itself, and some of the leaders you've learned from. And I think based on your leadership style, you're trying to be a mentor yourself. Would you say there's any kind of key creed or motto or advice that you can leave us with, whether it's advice to your younger self or just a kernel of wisdom that we can pass on?
Funny, as you asked that question, my heart rate actually went up. I think for me, it's sort of different. I get maybe it's similar to some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, but I think it's take nothing really for granted. I lost my mom when she was 63, so I was like 33. And I think being with her at the end gave me a lot of perspective. And then, right before we started Everside, I had sort of my own health scare. So about 2 weeks before signing our first office lease, I was diagnosed with cancer. I was 36. And, that was, I have to say, pretty intense. We had just had our third child. And so, a couple of days later, I went into surgery, and thankfully I'm now cancer-free. But that moment was pretty intense. And when you go through something like that, you got to make sure you have people around you that, like I said before, really have your back. So I definitely leaned on my wife and family a lot. I mean, our kids, we had 3 under 4. So we didn't really know the outcome for a few months. And my partner, Moritz. So my son picked, to your point on advice, my son picked the Rudyard Kipling poem, If, to recite at school. And I was going back and forth with him about what his favorite parts were. And I think in terms of perspective, there's the last point, which is, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, then the earth and everything that's in it. I think you get just a lot of perspective with the poem. And when we were going back and forth and asking him about it, and I think that part of it was, it brought it full circle for me. I think perspective is something people say they always wish they had in the moment, but it's quite hard to get it. But I'll tell you, the health experiences bring it to life a lot more than when you go through it just on a day-to-day crisis at work. So I hope that helps answer it.
I think also it does put everything in perspective. So thank you for sharing that so candidly. And I think it's a wonderful reminder of why we're here and never losing sight of that.
Nate, I want to thank you for, in a short period, covering so much ground, but you've done it very effectively. But most importantly, you've done it with passion, and it's been from the heart. And that's what makes you and your firm so special. It's been a true pleasure working with you all these years. And your ethos and the way that you go about your business shines through the whole firm. And that is wonderful to see. And it's great to be able to pass that on to the next generation, which is something that I think you're doing incredibly well. So we're very grateful, Aoifinn and I, to speak to you today. And we look forward to staying in touch and seeing the success that you've already done, but to continue on that success and to work with you for many years to come. Thank you.
Yeah, you guys are great. Aoifinn, it's been great to get to know you. And Tom, we really, we found each other at a pretty cool time, and we've worked really well together. We have enormous respect, like I said, for what you do and what you build. So yeah, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
So, Tom, I was looking at quotes on rowers before recording this, and one of the ones that's actually anonymous, but it comes up, it says, rowers do more before 8 a.m. than most people do all day. And I think that probably defines Nate in a nutshell there, not only in the actual sport of rowing, but I think in terms of the amount that has been packed into a career with such humility before many people are figuring out what way is up. It's quite remarkable.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And as I think was so obvious in the entire conversation we had with Nate, it's such a genuinely great person and such an honest person and such a kind person. And having myself been on Wall Street for quite some time now, I've come across a lot of people that have been very successful, but their personal attributes are maybe not the best, if we put it that way. And it's always this mentality that you have to be Machiavellian and you have to be ice cold to get to the top, And I think with Nate, it's the complete opposite. The guy is a fantastic guy, exceptional investor, exceptional human being, and has built a fantastic firm. I mean, that is a very unusual combination. And we are very pleased and blessed to be working with him as it happens. But aside from that, it is great to see that you can succeed with those attributes on Wall Street, because there's some wise men, you use an expression there about rowers getting up before 8 a.m. Another expression is nice guys finish last. And I happen to think that that is absolutely not the case here. Here we have a really nice guy who's finishing first. So that's my big takeaway. And as I said, it came through incredibly clearly in the time we had together with him today.
Indeed. And my other quote, because I did mine for a few of them, is no member of a crew is praised for the rugged individuality of his rowing. And that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I think that is definitely, there's very much a team spirit, whether it's a family team, a professional team, or even a team with clients, working in team and unison with clients that comes across in that whole conversation. It's not about rugged individuality. And I think that is a salient reminder in our industry that, as you said, there's more than one way to succeed here. So great conversation. And thank you for listening to the Alvine Talks podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.